week, I am joined by nutritionist Catherine Lippe, who is here to unpack a groundbreaking new report.
Children who receive healthy, balanced, nutritious food in their early years are healthier, they perform better in school.
What would you like these standards to look like ideally in practice, and how much of a difference do you think they would make to our children and our families?
The standards that are coming in September, so this new EYFS nutrition guidance, is a pretty good example of what we want to see practically.
Catherine, for listeners, be it parents or educators, what is one action that we can do to help? What would you like people to do after hearing this conversation? Hello, I'm Pip, and welcome to the Midwife Pip podcast, the home of expert information and real chats on all things pregnancy, birth, and beyond. This week, I am joined by nutritionist Catherine Lippe, who is here to unpack a groundbreaking new report. Early Years Nutrition, Setting the Standards for Change. With over 15 years of experience in paediatric nutrition across the public and private sectors, Catherine has been relentlessly passionate about improving early years nutrition, and having uncovered much of what's going on behind the scenes and how it's impacting our children's health, I am cheerleading her every step of the way. Released in July 2025 by the Cross Party Group on a fit and healthy childhood and sponsored by Nursery Kitchen, the report serves as a bold wake-up call for how we nourish children in the earliest stages of life. I have learned recently that whilst things like the number of toilets are monitored in childcare settings, the standards of food served to our children is not. So I am really passionate about supporting Catherine's work and improving the future for our little people. So welcome, Catherine, and thank you for coming on the podcast, and also thank you for lifting the lid on a box that needed to be opened and talked about.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And you know how much I like talking about early years nutrition. So this is a perfect opportunity for me.
It is so important, isn't it? It literally, sets the foundations for future health and longevity. But can we start with the big picture, Catherine? Why was this report that you've been working on needed now, and why is it so exciting? Why do we think that it could be this turning point for early years nutrition in the UK?
Good question. And you sort of said it yourself there already, Pip, is that we know that early years nutrition is really important. Early intervention is absolutely key when it comes to nutrition and health. We know that the evidence is overwhelming. It's the children who receive healthy, balanced, nutritious food in their early years are healthier, they perform better in school, it supports their growth and their development, not just in those early years, but for their future health outcomes as well. You know, it's got lifelong health prospects. So it's a really significant period of development. And you'll know that with everything that you do as well. That early intervention is absolutely key. And so for me, it's always been, I've worked in early years nutrition for, you know, as you said, over 15 years, almost the best part of 20 years now. I've stopped counting. But it's always been a passion of mine, and we have a real opportunity in the early years to get it right. And that could have significant consequences for children, for the economy, for future productivity, you know, impact on our health service. The consequences are really far reaching. So we can't overlook that really critical period. We mustn't overlook the early years. And I suppose for me, with all of my sort of experience and research in early years, it's always remained slightly in the shadows. We talk a lot about school foods, and we've got school food standards which are mandatory. They're not always very well inspected, but the school food standards we have in this country are mandatory. In other countries, Scotland, for example, Ireland, Wales, they have mandatory standards for food provision in nursery settings as well, in earlier settings. And in England, we don't have that. We haven't had that to date. So to me, there's this huge gaping hole And the consequences, if we fill those gaps in policy, can be really far-reaching. So that's sort of, that's my area. But what I was really keen to do with this report is to bring together research from all areas of early years nutrition. I'm really conscious, and I'm no expert in policy and health policy. So whilst I'm really passionate about early years, I was very keen to bring in expertise from other people. And that's why this report, it doesn't just focus on food provided in early years settings. It talks about the whole stages of the early years. So everything from preconception to pregnancy to breastfeeding and infant feeding, weaning, introduction of solid foods, the whole way through to those school years. And, you could argue really, where does early years nutrition stop? Because if it's preconception, actually we're talking about women, and could that be even adolescent women? So the cycle is sort of continuing. And so for me, this report was really important that we didn't have a siloed approach, because that's not effective when it comes to policy change. There's so much expertise out there, and I really wanted it to be a collaborative approach. There's so much research from all of those areas, and that's why this report is pretty beefy. There was lots of chapters because we wanted to uncover all of those, or cover all of those stages of early years in terms of food provision. And it sort of, scratches the surface on all of those different chapters. But we wanted to make sure that we can highlight the research from all of those different stages: preconception, pregnancy. There's a chapter on physical activity and dental health. All of these things come into it as well. So it was a real chance to bring together experts. So that's academics, that is researchers, it's policymakers, it's nutritionists, it's dietitians, midwives, dentists, the whole lot. We really wanted to bring this report together to talk about the research, where we're at currently with policy, and lay out some really tangible recommendations that we can sort of put in front of policymakers and put in front of politicians and say, this is what the research shows. These are our recommendations based on the research. This is what we think needs to happen in order for us to see a real improvement in early years nutrition and the knock-on effects that can have for the future as well. So in terms of kind of, what makes it a turning point, I think there's fantastic research out there. It's really, for me, it was about bringing that all together, laying it out and saying, here we are, this is what we need to do next, essentially.
My brand new book, Midwife Pip's Guide to a Positive Birth, is now available. So much more than a book, this is a guide that allows me to hold your hand through your birth preparation journey. With over a decade of experience and knowledge packed in to ensure you really are empowered in the way you deserve to achieve a positive birth, regardless of the twists and turns that crop up. Make sure that you get your hands on Midwife Pip's Guide to a Positive Birth book now and are empowered to have the birth experience that you deserve. And I think opening our eyes, I had no idea how unstandardized, how unregulated the early years space was, which quite frankly, as a mother of 2 young children is terrifying. It's shocking, right? We assume, I think, that these things are in place, and quite clearly they're not. And in lots of places, they're really lacking. And as a midwife, I suppose, Catherine, to me, the pregnancy space is such an easy win, because when you've got little people, their points of view, their wants and wishes come into play with nutrition, which can bring its own challenges. Whereas in pregnancy, it's almost your easiest quick win to get off to a good start, because it is just you. You haven't got to negotiate with somebody else and all of those other aspects that can come into play. So I love the fact that you zoomed out and kind of took it back to the earliest opportunities so that we can, early intervention, get ahead of that curve. And as we know, mother's nutrition in pregnancy has an impact on how smooth weaning goes and how accepting children are of other foods. So there's so many interlinks, and there's so many quick wins, and it's such a profound opportunity to kind of get ahead of that in pregnancy and follow it through. And I know that through your work and through the report, you uncovered some really eye-opening disparities,
Mhm.
like the food standards just not being regulated in early years, yet there is regulation inspections around things like number of toilets. Can you walk us through what you found and I guess how you feel about those findings too?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's so much obviously that is very tightly regulated in early years settings and early years provision, as it should be. And if anyone listening is familiar with the early years sector, you might have heard of the early years foundation stage, or the EYFS, and that is essentially the curriculum for the early years. It was brought into effect in 2008. Which, it seems mad now looking back that before 2008 we didn't have the EYFS, but it's a really fantastic document. It covers 7 key areas of learning, so everything from sort of numeracy and literacy, understanding the world, communication and language, personal, social, emotional. There's 7 different areas, and that is essentially what early years provision, early years care is focused around, is that EYFS. Now, until very recently, the only nod to nutrition or food provision within that EYFS was one line that said the food served must be balanced, varied, and nutritious. That was literally it. That's all it said. Just one line. No guidance about what balanced, varied, and nutritious actually looks like.
Yeah, that's so open to interpretation, isn't it? And I mean, it's
Exactly.
essentially useless wording.
Yeah, absolutely. It was sort of a nod to it. And this is again where some of my frustrations stem from, is that food has always been seen in the earlier sector, and not by all. I have to say there are some fantastic examples of good practice out there with earlier settings. It's the policy side of things that frustrates me, and it's always been seen as this sort of bolt on. And it's like, okay, it's lunchtime, let's get lunchtime done, and then we move on with the next part of the day, then we move on back to the curriculum, then we move on to the important stuff. And so this is sort of a shout out to say, hold on a minute, no, early years nutrition is a fundamental part of the early years learning process, is a fundamental part of the curriculum. It should be seen on the same level as safeguarding, as outdoor play, as mark making. It has such an impact on children's outcomes that it shouldn't be seen as a bolt on. And so this one liner that was in the EYFS, there was no training. So early years educators still in their education don't get any training on nutrition or food provision, and there's no inspection of what good food looks like. What we did have, and it still exists, is some voluntary guidance. So there was an acknowledgement, there's always been an acknowledgement that there is a sort of gap in this policy. So there was a document called Eat Better, Start Better, which also came out around 2008. And it's a voluntary piece of guidance. It's quite lengthy, it's 86 pages long. And for settings who are already stretched to absolute maximum in terms of resources and funding, it's quite a difficult thing to interpret. And a lot of the research, and some of this came out in our report, is that settings actually find that really overwhelming. And it's not easy to interpret because they don't have the training or the background to sort of really understand what that means. It's very lengthy. And with no one holding settings accountable because there's no inspection, what we know in the food and public health policy is that if it doesn't get measured, it doesn't get done.
Yeah.
And understandably too, because early years practitioners have so much else to focus on, and Ofsted inspections are a massive deal. We all know that, but food is one of the things that is not inspected by Ofsted. So actually, quite rightly, they're going to focus on the things that they are being held accountable for. And so food, no matter how much these individuals, and they're all fantastic early years educators who they might really value good nutrition and they might really see the importance importance of it, but they're not being supported in actually actioning anything, because the guidance has always been voluntary. They don't get any training or education on it, and it's not funded correctly. What I should say is that I'm really pleased this year we've seen a real turn in the tide of some of this guidance. So we are now gaining real traction in this area, and that's really, really encouraging. So in September this year, there is some new nutrition guidance, which is embedded in the EYFS, which will come into effect. That's a real improvement on anything that we've had in the past. It's still not considered mandatory as such, but it's as close to mandatory as we're going to get for the time being. And it is embedded in the EYFS. So what that means, the minute you embed it in the EYFS, settings will take notice of it. The sort of the terminology is that earlier settings now, they should have a regard to this nutrition guidance unless there's good reason not to. So it will be really interesting to see how all of that rolls out, and I think there is some uncertainty around it, and it still feels a little bit ambiguous for a lot of earlier settings from some of the conversations that I'm having with them. We don't really know if that's going to come into any conversations when they're inspected, but the chance is that it might. And that means that settings now are starting to sort of do a little bit more. So this new nutrition guidance that comes into place in September, it's much more detailed than that one-liner that we had before, and it does support settings in understanding what they should be serving, what foods they should be avoiding, and what foods they should be limiting. So it is more detailed. And I think that's I really celebrate that piece of guidance that's coming into place, because it's a step in the right direction. It also covers things like introduction of solid foods, some support and guidance around weaning, food safety, choking, all of those kind of things, responsive feeding, so actually the practice of how we feed children, not just what we're feeding them. And also catering for special dietary requirements as well. So it's a good piece of guidance. It's a really positive step in the right direction. But what we really need to see alongside that is support for the settings in delivering it. So we need to see training, and we need to see funding as well to really allow settings to implement that fully.
Yeah, 100%. And you can have such wonderful individuals working in settings with a passion for these things, but if there isn't the infrastructure and the support, then it's not going to happen. And that's why I love that you were like, right, well, let's then take it to the top and let's start chipping away at that policy and that infrastructure and that support that has to be there before we can roll it down and actually see the change that, my goodness, our children desperately need.
Yeah.
In terms of what we can do, Catherine, because when we create change, we know that we're not going to get the gold standard right away. Like you say, this is a step in the right direction. It's the first stepping stone, and we want to push for more. But right now, this is a good change, considering before there was pretty much absolutely nothing. But if we could have a magic wand, what would you like these standards to look like ideally in practice? And how much of a difference do you think they would make to our children and our families?
Yeah, really good question. I think the standards that are coming in September, so this new EYFS nutrition guidance, is a pretty good example of what we want to see practically. I think it's a balance, isn't it, of going from this one-liner to something, with my nutritionist hat on, would love to see standards that are way up here, and, really get it right, because we know that the food environment we bring our children up in is really challenging, and it's not necessarily set up for exposure to the types of foods that we would like them to be eating. So I think there is so much that earlier settings can do, but it is just one part of the puzzle. If I had a magic wand, I would like to see the 9 recommendations from our Setting the Standards report put into place. And that would, like I say, we don't want a siloed approach. It has to cover food served in earlier settings. But the food industry also is massively accountable. And so tighter regulation of food that is available and developed for toddlers and babies. We've seen a lot of that again this year, lots of research around baby food and the pouches, and recognition that, you know, the marketing and the legislation of those products needs to be tighter. And again, that's why it was really important for me in this report that we cover all of those things and not just early years food provision. If we're talking about early years food provision, I think what's coming out with the EYFS in September is really good. What it does is it's better than anything we've ever seen. It breaks food provision down into the different food groups. So it explains which foods belong to which food groups, and of those foods, what should you be serving and how often, and what foods should you avoid entirely. For example, breakfast cereals that are high in sugar or high in salt, or, you know, sweet desserts that are high in sugar. And it tells you which foods to limit as well. So there's some limit around processed meats, for example. So yes, you know, they can be included, but no more than once a week for something like sausages. Yeah. So actually, I think they've done it pretty well. You could go further, but I think we have to think of this as a sort of stepping stone approach. There has to be a roadmap. We've gone from one line which said food must be balanced, nutritious and varied.
Please eat well.
Yes, exactly. To something which is much more robust, and I think that's the best we can do for now. It's a really encouraging step, but it is just one part of the puzzle. So again, if I had my magic wand, I would also like to see, alongside that, improved funding for early years settings, specifically ring-fenced for food, because there's lots of issues around the funding as well, specifically for food. And I would like to see nutrition education included in early years educators' qualifications as well, because I think if we do that, that benefits obviously their role as an early years educator. It should be seen as an integral part of early years care, so it creates that level playing field. It also supports them as an individual. If they know more about nutrition for themselves, it's a good thing. So that's what I would really like to see. And I think the benefit of having those national standards and making them mandatory, as I say, at the moment, they're semi-mandatory. They're as close to mandatory as we're going to get, and I think it will be really interesting to see how much Ofsted inspectors sort of start to ask questions about it. But if we implement national food standards that are mandatory, it creates a level playing field for all earlier settings. Like I said, some settings are already demonstrating fantastic examples of best practice when it comes to food provision. But if we've got national standards that are mandatory and we know they're going to be inspected, we need the training to be there first and the funding to be there first. But if we know that's going to happen, it means that parents can feel really reassured that their child is receiving good nutrition wherever they choose for childcare. And so, you know, what's really important is that settings feel supported in delivering those standards, and at the moment that's still a big gap.
This episode is sponsored by BioGaia, designed to support tiny digestive systems and bring comfort when it's needed the most. Just a few drops a day can help maintain balance in your baby's gut, supporting everything from uncomfortable symptoms to overall well-being. Trusted by parents worldwide, BioGaia probiotics are gentle, safe, and backed by science, giving you peace of mind and hopefully a little more rest too. You can find BioGaia baby probiotics at biogaia.co.uk, because when your baby feels better, the whole family does too.
That makes total sense. So in terms of, we can have the information there and the guidance there, but actually if it's not being monitored, and then settings haven't got the support to implement. And I guess when we see so many things when it comes to inspections, whether it's like the NHS or schools or houses, you know, whatever, in other aspects, we often see change once something is inspected, fails or performs badly, and then there is this plan and this strategy to improve. And we almost feel like it needs to be inspected and shown that it's not working well for there to then be change. It's almost like that negative press would create that pressure to do that other stuff, to do that training, to create the proper inspections, to provide that support and infrastructure.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And, we see this is the frustrating thing, I suppose, because all the evidence is there. Rates of childhood obesity in children, sort of reception age children, have got worse year on year on year. The rates of dental decay in the early years is absolutely shocking, and children under the age of 5 who have to have their teeth extracted under general anaesthetic is costing the NHS, millions each year. And all of these statistics are getting worse. So nothing is working so far.
There's nothing reassuring like this. It has to change, otherwise,
Exactly.
it's of no benefit to anybody for it to stay this way, right?
Absolutely. And, we've seen some really good changes in school food. So the expansion of free school meals for families who are in receipt of universal credit, that's a really positive step to help some of those families who are living in poverty access a free school meal. And, many settings will have free school meals available to them anyway. All of London's schools have free school meals. So there's some really positive steps in school food. We're also seeing a commitment to improve the school food standards because they're quite outdated. And so that's really encouraging too. And so a lot of the policy change has been around school food. And in my eyes, I'm like, don't forget about early years. Because the reality is that actually, if we fall short in the early years, these interventions that are put into place later on aren't going to have the same impact. If we know that children's feeding preferences, their eating habits are established really early on. You said earlier, Pip, in pregnancy, you can actually influence your child's taste and preferences for taste through the amniotic fluid during pregnancy. So we need to acknowledge that. We need to bring early years nutrition out of the shadows. We need to recognise that actually early intervention could have a really positive effect for these later interventions too. So that's key to making a change to these dire consequences. And like I said, it's not just about food served in early year settings, it's also what the food industry are pushing and having tighter regulation around infant feeding, around all of these kind of commercial products that we have for young children. If we can expose children to the right types of foods when they're early, it in the early years, it has a profound effect.
Yeah, prevention's better than cure. That's what we always say, don't we? And yet we're coming in with this later intervention. It makes no sense whatsoever. Catherine, for listeners, be it parents or educators, what is one action that we can do to help? What would you like people to do after hearing this conversation?
It's a really good question. And I think I would love everyone listening to feel that they have a really important role to play in shaping children's food education, in shaping children's food environments as well, because they really do. So whether you're a parent or you're an early years educator or you're a teacher or you're a policymaker, there's so much that you can do. And I think as a parent, you can start by, asking questions about the food that's served in your early years setting. Sitting up and paying attention to those things, doing the research, reading these reports. That the report that we produced, it sounds very academic and sort of high level, but
very easy to read. It's so easy with infographics, and it's honestly very accessible and user friendly.
Good. I'm glad you said that. But yeah, that was how we wanted to design it. So it's not just a report for MPs or politicians to read. This report lays out the guidance and it lays out the research and talks about the recommendations. So it's accessible online, and anybody can read it. So parents who are interested can access that. Go and ask questions. It might sort of make you think about writing to your MP about infant formula or baby food. It might make you want to ask questions about the food that's served in your childcare setting. So you can really make a difference to that food environment just by asking questions. And we did a parent survey as part of the research for this report. And, you know, there's no parent that doesn't care about the food that their child is being served or the food that is available to them. And it's a really tricky food environment to navigate. You know, we all know that. It's a real challenge to get that balance between sort of practical, what's practical for you as a family, what your child likes, what they'll actually accept, and then, you know, the science and the nutrition behind it as well. So it's not about putting all the pressure on parents. This isn't parents' job to solve. It's the food environment. There's a huge issue in our food environment, but parents can support that by just asking questions and doing research and reading and going to professionals, you know, like registered nutritionists and dietitians, and having conversations to get the evidence, to get the science. So yeah, if you're a parent, there's lots you can do. If you're an educator, you know, consider how your daily practices around food, not just the food that's served, because sometimes that's outside of your control, if that's, you know, the chef or the manager, or perhaps the nursery catering provider who supplies that food. But you can still think about your practices within that setting. What does your mealtime environment look like? How can you support children sitting and eating and learning about food together? All of those things can make a big difference. So, you know, ultimately the action I would love to everyone to take is to value early years nutrition as foundational. You know, those first few years are a really golden opportunity. There's a real window there. And if we get food right at the very start, we set up that healthier foundation for children, and that benefits everybody.
Absolutely. Oh, Catherine, I love your work, and yeah, completely feel your passion for it, because I think it's easy to make assumptions as parents that, you know, these earlier settings have got it all covered, but actually to recognise that we need to be more inquisitive and we need to ask questions. And collectively as a community, we need to hold those standards and really push for that change and watch and wait. You know, now that this comes in September, actually let's watch and wait and see what happens. And as parents, I think it gives you more leverage to ask those questions, because it is then in that guidance that they have to follow. So helpful. And thank you for the work that you've done putting this together, because I know it has been a long, passion driven, challenging project for you, but I hope it's all starting to feel very worthwhile, Catherine.
It is. Thank you. Yeah. And, you know, thanks for your support. It's great to always, like I say, collaboration is absolutely key with all of this. So there's so much that we can all do. And I think what's really exciting for me is that the tide is starting to turn. You know, we've got this new guidance coming out. It feels like this space is really gaining momentum. We're starting to see some policy change. We've got the Best Start strategy from government. You know, we've got this new EYFS nutrition guidance. So there's real traction. And what I'm keen to do is just make sure that, you know, we all grab that hope and we grab hold of those opportunities, and we just keep driving it forwards, because everybody's mission is the same thing, is to improve our food environment and make it easier for parents to make the right choices when it comes to feeding our children, which ultimately, you know, like I said, it benefits everybody. So there's real hope and there's real optimism, and that is just hugely motivating for me, and I hope for other people in the field as well.
Oh, Catherine, thank you so much for coming on to talk and for all the work you're doing. You really are an absolute star.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to speak to you.
If you have listened to this birth story, enjoyed it, and feel that you are ready to really embrace and dedicate yourself to having the most informed, supported, and empowered journey, and want to see if we may be able to support you in YPJ, your pregnancy and postnatal journey, please drop me a Instagram DM at midwife_pip, or get in touch on my email, pip@midwifepip.com, and let's chat through things and see if we might be a good match for each other. I hope you've enjoyed listening, and wishing you all the best on your journey through pregnancy, birth, and beyond.